my father's will was read. My uncle was wearing a new watch. I noticed it before I noticed anything else. That flash of gold at his wrist when he reached across the table to pull the document toward himself, as if it already belonged to him. A Rolex. Oyster Perpetual. I know because my father had the exact same one, and I had watched him wind it every Sunday morning at the kitchen table for as long as I could remember. My uncle's was newer, shinier. I remember thinking, he bought it already. He already knew what the will was going to say. I didn't say anything. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and listened. My name came up twice. Both times my uncle interrupted. That was 8 months ago. Last Tuesday, I sat in a law office in downtown Ottawa and watched a federal investigator slide a folder across the table toward my uncle's lawyer. My uncle wasn't there. He was already in custody. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just thought about my father's watch, the real one. The one I had found in his study 3 weeks after he died, still in its original box, with a note tucked underneath it in his handwriting that said, "For Vera. She'll know what to do with it." He was right. I did. My father built his company over 32 years. Halcourt Property Management, commercial leasing, residential portfolios, a handful of development contracts across Eastern Ontario. Not glamorous. Not the kind of business that gets written up in magazines, but solid, honest. The kind of business where the same tenants stayed for 15 years because my father remembered their kids' names and fixed things when they broke without making anyone feel like a burden. He died in February. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to funeral, it was 4 months, and I was there for all of it. Driving him to appointments in Kingston, sleeping on the pullout in his study when the nights got bad, managing his medication schedule in a spreadsheet I still can't bring myself to delete. My mother had passed 6 years earlier. It had been just the two of us for a long time. My uncle, my father's younger brother, showed up at the hospital exactly twice. Once in November, when we still thought there might be options. Once at the end, when he arrived 40 minutes after my father stopped breathing. Smelling faintly of airport and cologne, with his girlfriend standing in the hallway looking uncomfortable in a coat that cost more than my monthly rent. He hugged me at the funeral, told me my father would have wanted us to stick together. I nodded. I was too tired to do anything else. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the burial. I drove myself. I wore the same gray blazer I'd worn to every difficult thing in the past 4 months. The estate lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Calder who had known my father for 20 years, read the document in full before anyone spoke. My father had left the house and its contents to me. He had left his personal savings, approximately $180,000, split evenly between me and my uncle. And he had left the business, Halcourt Property Management, its assets, its contracts, its accounts, to both of us jointly, with the instruction that I would serve as managing director. My uncle's jaw tightened. He asked Mr. Calder to clarify. Mr. Calder, clarify. Mr. Calder, clarify. My uncle asked again. Calder read the relevant section a second time, slowly, and then folded his hands on the table. The arrangement is clear, he said. Vera holds operational authority. My uncle nodded. He said, Of course that makes sense. He said it in the tone of a man who has already decided that it doesn't. The first month, I thought maybe I was wrong about him. He came into the office. He attended the meetings I scheduled. He was pleasant with the staff, charming with the tenants, and he deferred to my decisions in a way that felt almost genuine. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief makes you suspicious of everyone. Then, in April, our bookkeeper, a woman named Ms. Fontaine, who had worked for my father for 11 years, came to my office and closed the door behind her. She had noticed a discrepancy, a transfer of $22,000 from one of Halcourt's operating accounts to a numbered company she didn't recognize. She had flagged it internally 3 weeks ago and left a note for my uncle, who had offered to handle the quarterly reconciliation. He had told her it was a vendor payment. She had asked for the invoice. He had told her it was being processed. No invoice had come. I asked her to pull everything she could find. Every transfer, every reconciliation, every account she had access to, going back to December, 2 months before my father died, during a period when my uncle had briefly been added as a signatory to help manage things while I was focused on palliative care. She came back the next morning with a folder. I sat in my car in the parking garage and read it for an hour. $47,000. Moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags. vendor names that didn't exist, an account number registered to a holding company in Alberta with my uncle's girlfriend listed as the director. I drove home. I fed my cat. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about what my father had said to me in the hospital 2 weeks before the end, when he was still lucid enough to have a real conversation. He had said, "Your uncle is going to be difficult. I know that. Just don't let him make you loud. Loud people lose." I thought about that for a long time. Then I called a lawyer, not Mr. Calder, someone else, a woman named Miss Okonkwo, who specialized in corporate fraud and came recommended by a friend from law school who told me simply, she doesn't lose. The thing about my uncle is that he is very smart and he knows it, which is the same as saying he's careless. He assumed I was too deep in grief to look closely at anything. He had watched me for 2 months and concluded that I was managing, just managing, holding it together by the edges, and that a woman holding herself together by the edges doesn't have the bandwidth to audit the books. He was wrong, but I didn't tell him that. Miss Okonkwo advised me to document everything and say nothing. She explained what we were dealing with: fraudulent transfers from a corporate account, potential breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on what the numbered company had been used for, possible wire fraud charges under the criminal code. She said we needed to build a complete picture before we moved. She said the moment I confronted him, he would move the money and cover his tracks, so I didn't confront him. I went to the office every day. I sat in meetings. I answered his emails within the hour. I approved his expense reports, the legitimate ones, and I said nothing about the ones I had flagged in a separate file on a laptop that never connected to the company network. Meanwhile, Ms. Fontaine quietly, methodically, worked backwards through every account she could access and documented what she found. Meanwhile, Ms. Okonkwo worked with a forensic accountant named Mr. Tremblay, who could access things we couldn't. Meanwhile, I waited. My uncle bought a condo. I know because he mentioned it in passing, something about finally having a place of his own in the city, and I smiled and said that sounded wonderful. It was a cash purchase. I know that too now. The tree $10,000. Free $10,000, paid in full, in March, 1 month after the will was read, before any of his share of the inheritance had been dispersed. He had been planning this before my father was cold. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't feel like anger. It doesn't feel hot. It doesn't make you want to shout or throw things. It feels like clarity, like everything becoming very still and very sharp, and you moving through the world with a steadiness that surprises even you. That is what I felt for those 3 months. People kept asking me how I was doing, and I kept saying, "Fine, thank you," taking it one day at a time, and I meant it. I was fine. I was better than fine. I had a plan. In June, Ms. Okonkwo told me we had enough. The forensic accounting was complete. The total, transfers, falsified vendor payments, a fraudulent invoice for consulting services that had been submitted under a name similar enough to a real contractor to pass a casual glance, came to $94,000. And then there was the numbered company. Mr. Dinta Dollars. Tremblay had traced it to a chain of 2 more holding companies before it terminated in an account in my uncle's girlfriend's name, which had been used to purchase, among other things, the Rolex I had noticed at the will reading. She didn't know, I think. Or maybe she did. That wasn't my problem to sort out. Miss Okonkwo filed a report with the RCMP's Financial Crime Unit. She also filed a civil application to freeze my uncle's assets pending investigation, including the condo. She had documentation showing the purchase funds were traceable to Halcourt accounts, which meant the property had been acquired with stolen money. I signed everything she put in front of me. I went home and I slept better than I had in months. My uncle called me on a Thursday morning in July. He was cheerful. He wanted to schedule a meeting about the Q3 projections. He said he had some ideas about the Kanata portfolio and thought we should sit down. I said that sounded great and suggested Friday at 10. He didn't know. As of Thursday morning, the report had been filed. The asset freeze application was being processed, and his own lawyer, a man he had retained for unrelated reasons and apparently forgotten to update about this particular situation, had not yet received any notice. I showed up at the office at 9:30. Ms. Fontaine was already there. She had made coffee, which I thought was kind of her. At 10:15, 2 investigators from the RCMP arrived. I had been told to expect them and had left word with reception. They were professional and quiet. One of them asked for the conference room. I showed them in. My uncle arrived at 10:22. He came in the front door with his jacket over one arm and his phone in his hand. and he got about 4 steps into the reception area before he registered that something was wrong. I was standing near the window. I watched him notice me and then notice the 2 people in the conference room visible through the glass wall, and then look back at me. He said my name. Just my name. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to figure out what they know. I said, "Good morning. They're waiting for you." He started to say something else. He stopped. He looked at the conference room again. I said, "I found the transfers, uncle. All of them." Mr. Tremblay found the rest. The color went out of his face in a way I hadn't expected. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, just quietly, like a light being turned down. He said, "Vera, listen." I said, "I think you should go talk to them." I turned and walked back to my office. I closed the door. I sat down at my desk. Outside, I heard voices, low, professional, my uncle's rising briefly and then settling, and then the sound of people walking toward the elevator. I opened my laptop and started on the Q3 projections myself. The civil case took 3 more months to work through. The asset freeze held. The condo was included. His personal accounts were subject to a recovery claim for the full $94,000, plus legal costs, which Ms. Okonkwo estimated conservatively. The RCMP investigation resulted in 2 charges, fraud over $5,000 under Section 380 of the Criminal Code and breach of trust. His lawyer, a different one now, someone his girlfriend had found, entered a not guilty plea, but Ms. Okonkwo told me privately that the documentation was thorough enough that she would be surprised if it went to trial. It didn't. He took a plea in November, 12 months of house arrest, 2 years probation, full restitution ordered. The condo was sold. The proceeds went to Halcourt's accounts. He has not called me since. People asked me sometimes, friends, mostly, and once a journalist who had heard about the case through someone in the legal community. They asked how I managed to stay calm through all of it, how I went to that office every day and sat across from him and didn't say anything, how I didn't confront him the moment I found the first transfer. I tell them what my father told me about not being loud. But there's more to it than that. The truth is that staying quiet wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the morning I found Ms. Fontaine's folder. Sitting in that parking garage, reading those pages, and feeling, underneath all the anger and the grief and the exhaustion, a small and terrible sadness, not for myself, for my father, because he had trusted his brother. He had added him as a signatory because he trusted him and because he was dying and he needed help, and his brother had seen that as an opportunity. My father was a good man. He believed in people more than the evidence sometimes warranted. That was not a flaw. I don't want to be the kind of person who sees that as a flaw. But I am also my father's daughter. And my father built a company that survived 32 years by keeping clean books, honoring contracts, and never letting anyone walk away with something that wasn't theirs. I have his watch now. I had it serviced at a shop on Sparks Street, and they told me it was in nearly perfect condition. I wear it on Sundays the way he did. I don't wind it at the kitchen table because I live alone and it would feel strange, but I think about him when I put it on. Halcourt had its best quarter in 6 years this past fall. Ms. Fontaine got a raise. I hired 2 new property managers and signed a contract for a development project in Barhaven that my father had been cultivating for years before he got sick. My uncle's girlfriend left him sometime in September. I heard this through an old family friend who thought I'd want to know. I didn't have a strong feeling about it either way. I hope she's all right. The numbered company has been dissolved. The accounts are closed. The paper trail, which is very long and very detailed, and which Mr. Mayans Tremblay organized into a document that is genuinely impressive in its thoroughness, sits in a file at Ms. Okonkwo's office and a duplicate at mine. My father said, "Don't be loud. Loud people lose." He was right. But I'd add one thing he didn't say. Maybe because he didn't need to. Maybe because he thought I already knew. Keep the records. Every one of them. From the beginning, before you think you'll need them. Because the people who want to take from you are counting on you to be too tired, too grieving, too trusting to look closely. Look closely. People sometimes want there to be a dramatic moment at the center of a story like this. A confrontation. A door slamming. Someone saying the perfect thing at exactly the right time. I think that's what we're trained to expect, that justice arrives loudly, that it announces itself. It didn't, in my case. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in a conference room in Ottawa, quiet and methodical. in the form of 2 investigators and a folder that Ms. Auchenqual had spent 4 months helping me build. My uncle walked into that office expecting a routine meeting. He left in a very different situation, and I went back to my desk and opened a spreadsheet. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the moment he realized, not the look on his face, the spreadsheet. Because that's where this actually started, not with any dramatic decision, not with a speech, but with Ms. Fontaine closing my office door one afternoon and saying, quietly, that something didn't add up. One discrepancy, one flag, one woman who had worked for my father for 11 years and still cared enough to notice. I think about what my uncle was counting on. He was counting on me being overwhelmed, which I was. He was counting on grief making me careless, which it might have if I hadn't had people around me who were paying attention when I couldn't. He was counting on the assumption that loyalty is naive, that someone who trusted her father, who believed in the business he built, who wore her heart plainly enough for people to see, must also be someone easy to deceive. He confused openness with weakness. That's where he went wrong. The $94,000 didn't appear because he was clever. It appeared because he was careless in the way that people are careless when they've decided someone isn't watching. He moved money in small amounts. He invented vendors with plausible names. He bought a watch, then a condo, then started looking at properties in Scottsdale. He kept showing up to meetings and smiling at me across the table, and he never once considered that I might be smiling back for my own reasons. My father built something over 32 years by being precise and honest, and above all, consistent. He showed up. He kept records. He treated the people around him as partners rather than obstacles. Those weren't just business habits. They were a way of moving through the world, one that compounded slowly into something no one could easily take. What I learned from all of this is not that you should be suspicious of everyone. That would be the wrong lesson. The right lesson is smaller and more practical. Document things, not because you expect betrayal, but because clarity protects you, and vagueness protects everyone else. My father's books were clean. Miss Fontaine knew them inside out. That's what made it possible to catch what didn't belong. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the daily decision to do things properly, even when no one is watching, even when you're exhausted, even when cutting corners would be easier. My uncle chose shortcuts his whole life and called it strategy. My father chose the longer road and called it work. 32 years later, one of them must something worth inheriting. I wear his watch on Sundays. I try to be worthy of it.